On a grey January afternoon in 1942, test pilots at Wright Field in Ohio gathered around a new prototype that had just finished its first flights. The aircraft, marked NA-73X, later called the Mustang, looked smooth and modern. The engineers had worked very fast. North American Aviation had designed and built this aircraft in only 120 days, an amazing achievement by any standard. But when the reports came back from high-altitude test flights, the conclusion was clear and unforgiving. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison V1 710 engine began to lose power. The Mustang climbed slowly. It struggled to keep its speed. And at the altitudes where American bombers would need fighter cover over Europe, the Mustang simply could not keep up. The hangar at Wright Field was cold that winter. The big doors were drafty, and the Ohio wind slipped through every gap in the metal walls. Inside, the Mustang sat under bright electric lights, its aluminium skin reflecting the overhead bulbs in dull, broken patches. Mechanics moved around it with clipboards and tools, checking fuel lines and control surfaces. The aircraft looked right. Everything about its design suggested it should perform well. The fuselage was smooth and aerodynamic. The wings were shaped with laminar flow principles to reduce drag. The cockpit was roomy. The landing gear was strong. But the engine, the Allison V1 710, had been designed for low-level flying. It did not have an efficient supercharger for high altitude, and at the heights where the war over Europe was being fought, it simply could not deliver. In a small office next to the hangar, a procurement officer reviewed the test data and wrote his conclusion: high-altitude performance, not suitable for European theater operations. The words were careful and bureaucratic, but they carried real weight. The U.S. Army Air Forces had hoped the Mustang could fill an important gap, but now it seemed the aircraft would only be useful for low-level roles: ground attack, reconnaissance, tactical support. Those were important jobs, but they were not the main priority in 1942. What the Army needed most was a fighter that could escort heavy bombers deep into Germany and protect them from Luftwaffe interceptors. With its current engine, the Mustang could not do that. The decision was made quietly. The Army would order the Mustang, but only in limited numbers, and it would be used where its strengths could be exploited, and its weakness at altitude would not matter. No one completely discarded the Mustang. It was too well designed for that. But nobody believed it would become a decisive weapon either. It was a good aircraft with a fatal flaw. And in early 1942, with the war spreading and resources under pressure, there was no time to fix problems that looked impossible to solve. The Mustang was put to one side, neither abandoned nor truly favored. It would wait. However, across the Atlantic, one man was looking at this aircraft with different eyes, and that man was about to change everything. By the spring of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were committed to a strategy many people thought was impossible. Daylight precision bombing, in theory, would allow B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators to attack German factories accurately while defending themselves with tight formations and heavy gunfire. The idea had been argued and refined for years. On paper, it seemed logical. Bombers flying in close formation, each one armed with multiple .50 caliber machine guns, could create overlapping fields of fire that would make any attacking fighter pay a terrible price. By flying in daylight, bombardiers could see their targets clearly and drop their bombs with accuracy, hitting factories and rail yards instead of destroying whole neighborhoods. But the theory ignored one hard fact. The bombers could not reach their targets and return home without fighter escort. And no American fighter had the range to go with them all the way. The P-47 Thunderbolt, big, powerful fighters, could fly about 475 miles from their bases before they had to turn back. That was an impressive range, but still not enough. Targets deep inside Germany, factories at Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Leipzig, were further away. British Spitfires, although excellent in dogfights, had an even shorter range, so American bomber formations flew with escort until they crossed into German airspace. Then the fighters had to turn back, their fuel low and no other choice. The bombers continued alone. What happened next was predictable and tragic. Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109s and FW-190s, waited until the escorts left, then attacked. They came in groups, in waves, firing 20mm cannon and rockets. They aimed at engines and cockpits. They aimed at the wings and bomb bays. The bomber formations, heavy with guns, could not fully protect themselves against trained fighter pilots attacking from every direction, especially from the front and above, where the bombers' firepower was weakest. On 17 August 1943, a raid against the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and aircraft factories at Regensburg became one of the bloodiest days of the bombing campaign. 60 American bombers did not come back. 600 pilots and crew members were killed or captured in one afternoon. The surviving aircraft limped home to England with torn wings and fuselages, with wounded men lying on the floor, with hydraulic fluid running down metal like red blood. Among bomber crews, the statistics were spoken quietly but understood by everyone. Out of every 100 men who started a tour of 25 missions, only about 20 would finish. The rest would be killed, captured, or badly injured. A young 19-year-old airman, sitting in the base canteen the night before a mission, might have tried to do the maths. He had flown 7 missions, 18 more to go. If only 1 in 5 survived, what were his chances? He might have written a letter home, telling his mother that everything was fine, that the weather was good, that the food wasn't bad. He did not tell her about his dreams full of engine noise and smoke-filled skies, or the faces of men who had not returned. The losses could not continue at that rate. If the bombing campaign was to go on, something had to change. Either the bombers would have to stop flying deep into Germany, or the Americans would have to find a fighter that could go the distance with them. In Britain, that solution was taking shape, and it started with one man who had the vision to see what others had missed. His name was Ronald W. Harker, and in April 1942 he was a test pilot for Rolls-Royce at Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. Harker was not an ordinary pilot. He had flown Spitfires, Hurricanes, and almost every British fighter built during the war. He knew engines, he knew airframes, and he had a rare ability. He could look at an aircraft and understand not only what it was doing, but what it might be able to do. One day in April, Harker was asked to fly to a nearby airfield to examine a new aircraft the RAF had just received from the United States. It was one of the first Mustangs delivered to Britain, and the RAF was using it for low-level reconnaissance. Harker arrived at the airfield, stepped out of his car, and saw the Mustang parked on the tarmac. He may have paused for a moment just to look at it. The aircraft was beautiful. It had smooth lines he had never quite seen on a fighter before. The fuselage was long and low. The wings were broad but thin. The cockpit sat high, giving good visibility. There were no extra bumps or sharp corners. It was clearly designed by people who understood airflow. Harker spoke with the RAF pilot who had flown it. They told him it was fast at low level, easy to fly, and had impressive range. But they also mentioned the engine. Above 15,000 feet, performance dropped. The aircraft became sluggish. It lost its climb. For high-altitude combat, it simply was not good enough. Harker climbed into the cockpit. He sat down, looked over the instruments, and felt the layout of the controls. Everything was well placed. There was plenty of room. The view was excellent. He started the Allison engine and listened. It ran smoothly. He closed the canopy, checked the gauges, and took off. He flew the Mustang for about an hour, testing it at different altitudes and speeds. At a low level, it was excellent. It was fast and responsive. But as he climbed higher, he felt the engine losing power. The aircraft still flew, but it no longer felt sharp and quick like it had at low level. It was exactly the problem everyone had described. But when Harker landed and climbed out of the cockpit, he was not thinking about what the aircraft could not do. He was thinking about what it could do. He thought about the airframe, how it cut through the air, how the wings produced lift so efficiently. He thought about the fuel tanks, much larger than on any fighter he had flown before. And he thought about the Merlin engine, the power plant that his company, Rolls-Royce, had built for the Spitfire and was still improving. The Merlin 61, the latest version, had a 2-stage supercharger. It could keep its power at high altitude. It was strong and reliable. And as Harker stood there looking at the Mustang, an idea formed in his mind. What would happen if you took out the Allison engine and put a Merlin in its place? It was a simple question, but it carried huge possibilities. The Mustang airframe was good. The Merlin engine was good. Together, they might be something more. They might be the solution no one was looking for, because no one had thought to look. Harker returned to Rolls-Royce and wrote a report. He did not only describe the aircraft he had flown, he described the aircraft he believed could be built. He proposed that Rolls-Royce should take a Mustang airframe and install a Merlin 61 engine. He argued that the resulting aircraft would have excellent high-altitude performance while keeping the long range of the original design. He wrote that it could become the long-range escort fighter the Allies desperately needed. Senior engineers at Rolls-Royce read his report. They saw its value. They already knew about the crisis over Germany, about bombers being shot down because they did not have escort fighters, and they knew that if Harker's idea worked, it could change the balance of the air war. The decision was made to go ahead. Rolls-Royce would convert a Mustang, install a Merlin 61, and see what happened. The work began at Hucknall in the summer of 1942. Hucknall Airfield was not one of the big bases. It was a test station, a place where prototypes were flown and ideas were tried. The hangars there smelled of oil, metal, and the cool air of English summer mornings. Engineers worked in coats and gloves because even in summer the hangars were not warm. The Mustang was rolled into one of the hangars. The Allison engine was removed carefully, one bolt and one pipe at a time. Engineers measured the airframe and calculated where the Merlin would sit and how it would be mounted. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison, which meant parts of the airframe had to be strengthened. The engine mounts had to be redesigned. The cooling system, the radiator and pipework, had to be modified to handle the extra heat from the more powerful engine. The propeller had to be matched to the Merlin's power curve. The work took months. It was not a simple job of swapping one engine for another. It was a problem of redesigning systems, balancing weight, and making sure everything fit and worked together. The engineers worked slowly and carefully, checking everything twice, then 3 times. They knew that if something was wrong, if a single bolt was loose or a pipe leaked, the test pilot could die. By October 1942, the first Mustang fitted with a Merlin engine was ready at Hucknall. It would not be flown by Ronald Harker, but by Rolls-Royce's chief test pilot, Captain R.T. Shepard. Harker had provided the idea. Shepard would prove it in the air. That morning, under a cold, clear English sky, Shepard opened the throttle and lifted the re-engined Mustang into the air. The aircraft climbed hard and fast, holding its power well above 20,000 feet. Over the next series of flights, test data showed what Harker had suspected. Compared to the Allison version, the Merlin Mustang's top speed jumped into the 430 to 440 miles per hour range at altitude, its ceiling rose dramatically, and its effective range with drop tanks would be far greater than any fighter then in service. The figures were carefully recorded over the next few days as the Mustang was flown again and again. With the Merlin 61 engine, it could climb to 25,000 feet in less than 8 minutes. At that height, it could reach a speed of 437 miles per hour, faster than most German fighters. With drop tanks, its range stretched to 1,650 miles. That meant it could fly from Britain to Berlin and back, with fuel left to fight over the target and on the return journey. This was exactly what the war needed, and it had all started because one test pilot had seen potential where others had only seen a problem. When the news about the improved Mustang reached Washington in early 1943, people were still skeptical. The Army Air Forces had already committed production resources to the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. Changing direction would mean rearranging factories, retraining pilots, and risking delays in operations. But the data from the British could not be denied. The numbers were clear. The performance was even clearer. In April 1943, the decision was made. The United States would build the Mustang with a Packard-built version of the Merlin engine. The aircraft would be designated the P-51B. Orders were placed. Factories began to tool up, and pilots started their conversion training. By the autumn of 1943, the first Merlin-powered Mustangs began to arrive in Britain. They were assigned to 8th Air Force fighter groups, and pilots who had flown the P-47 were transferred to the new aircraft. The training was brief, the need was urgent, and within a few weeks the Mustang would face its first real test in the skies over Germany. But before the Mustang could prove itself in combat, it had to meet the Luftwaffe, and that first meeting would come sooner than anyone expected. By late 1943, German fighter pilots like Oberleutnant Franz Stigler began to notice something unsettling over Germany. On some missions near Bremen and other industrial cities, they looked up from their Bf-109 and FW-190 and saw American escorts at altitudes where no P-47 or Spitfire should have had the fuel to roam. The new fighters were slim, with long fuselages and straight wings, and they did not turn back at the frontier. When the Luftwaffe tried to punch through to the bombers, these Mustangs stayed in the way, climbing with them, diving through their formations, and then climbing back again. In debriefings that winter, pilots reported the same thing from airfields across Germany. The Americans now have a fighter that stays with the bombers all the way. The safe zone beyond escort range was starting to disappear. One pilot said, "They're waiting for us at altitude. They don't turn back. They stay with the bombers all the way." Another pilot added, "They are faster than we expected, more maneuverable than the Thunderbolt, and there are a lot of them." Reports from many airfields were collected and sent to Luftwaffe headquarters. Intelligence officers identified the new fighter as the P-51 Mustang, a type that had been mostly ignored earlier in the war. Now it was appearing in large numbers and in a place where it should not have been, deep inside German airspace, at high altitude, protecting bombers the Luftwaffe had been systematically destroying for months. For German fighter pilots, the Mustang's presence over Germany was more than a tactical problem. It was a psychological shift. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies over Europe in the early years of the war, was now fighting defensively over its own territory against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger every month. The safe zone they had once enjoyed, the area beyond the range of Allied escort fighters, was disappearing. The Americans had found a way to bring their fighters all the way to the target. And the Luftwaffe was about to lose that advantage for good, but they did not yet know how bad things were going to become. In the first week of February 1944, weather officers at 8th Air Force headquarters in Britain watched the patterns over Europe closely. For weeks, heavy clouds had covered Germany, grounding heavy bombers and delaying the most ambitious campaign yet planned, a coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry. The plan, codenamed Operation Argument, called for continuous bombing, Americans by day, British by night, against factories, assembly plants, and airfields across Germany. The aim was not only to damage production, but to draw the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition it could not win. The weather had not cooperated, but the planners knew that when the skies cleared, they had to be ready to move quickly. The window of opportunity would be short, and everything, crews, aircraft, bombs, fuel, was already prepared. On the 20th of February, the skies cleared. At dawn, the first bombers took off. For 6 days in a row, American bombers struck targets deep inside Germany. Aircraft plants at Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and beyond. Huge formations, sometimes more than 1,000 bombers, flew across the North Sea, over the European coast, and into the heart of Germany. And this time, they did not go alone. P-51 Mustangs flew ahead of the bomber streams, climbing to 30,000 feet and positioning themselves to intercept German fighters before they could reach the bombers. When Luftwaffe fighters climbed to meet the Americans, they found themselves fighting not only over their own country, but also at a disadvantage. The Mustangs, with their high speed and superior climb, attacked from above. Over Oschersleben, on the first day of the campaign, Mustangs from the 354 fighter group met a formation of Bf-109S assembling to attack the bombers. The American pilots dived through the German formation, breaking it apart before it could coordinate. In the confused fighting that followed, the 6.50 caliber machine guns of each Mustang, firing together at a combined rate of 3,000 rounds per minute, tore apart the lightly armored German fighters. The 50 caliber bullet was a powerful weapon. It was heavier and more destructive than the machine gun rounds used by most German fighters. It could punch through aluminium, rip open fuel tanks, and wreck engines. A short burst from 6 guns could cripple a fighter. A longer burst could tear it to pieces. At Leipzig on the 22nd of February, the fighting was even more intense. More than 300 German fighters rose to defend the factories. But the American escorts, P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s, were waiting. The battle spread across 50 miles of sky. Pilots on both sides reported running out of ammunition. Some German aircraft, out of fuel, crashed while trying to land at damaged airfields. Perhaps a Mustang pilot, in the heat of the fight, had no time to think about strategy or history. He simply flew, fired, turned, and fired again. But later, back at base, when pilots gathered in the debriefing room and described what they had seen, they may have begun to understand that something had changed. The Germans were no longer hunting the bombers with the confidence they once had. They were fighting to survive. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 600 aircraft, fighters, bombers, and transports, and more importantly, hundreds of experienced pilots. Among them were squadron leaders, instructors, and veterans who could not be easily replaced. American losses were also heavy, 226 bombers and 28 fighters. But the balance had shifted. Where once the Luftwaffe had taken a terrible toll on every American raid, now the defenders were paying the higher price. A Luftwaffe pilot, in a diary entry found after the war, wrote, "We no longer hunt the bombers. We are trying to survive their escorts. The Americans have changed the rules of the game." Big Week did not destroy the Luftwaffe completely. German factories continued to build aircraft, and pilots kept flying. But the air war had changed in a fundamental way. The Americans had proved that they could strike deep into Germany, in daylight, and return. And they had done it not by luck, but by bringing a fighter that could protect the bombers all the way to the target and back. The P-51 Mustang had proved itself. From that point on, the question was no longer whether the Allies could win control of the air, but how long it would take. By the summer of 1944, the balance of air power over Europe had shifted decisively. The numbers told the story, but they did not fully show the experience of the men who flew the missions or faced the enemy in combat. The P-51 Mustang, once an obscure prototype with a flawed engine, had become the most important and most feared American fighter over the European battlefield. Range: 1,650 miles with drop tanks, a distance that allowed Mustang pilots to escort bombers to targets as far as Berlin, Breslau, and Prague, and still have fuel to fight enemy fighters over the target and on the way home. Firepower: 6 Browning M2.5 zero-caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 1,880 rounds of ammunition. The 50-caliber bullet, heavier and more destructive than the machine gun rounds used by most German fighters, could rip through aluminium, punch holes in fuel tanks, and destroy engines. Speed: 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, faster than the Bf-109G and roughly equal to the FW-190A at altitude. Climb: better than all but the very latest German fighters, allowing Mustang pilots to gain height quickly and attack from above. Kill ratio: by mid-1944, Mustang pilots were claiming more than 4 German aircraft destroyed for every P-51 lost in air combat, a record no other Allied fighter could match. But the numbers did not tell the whole story. German pilots who survived encounters with Mustangs described a new kind of air war. The Americans were no longer flying in predictable patterns. They were not simply escorting bombers and then turning for home. Instead, the Mustangs roamed across the sky, hunting for targets of opportunity. They attacked German fighters on the ground, sweeping airfields before the Luftwaffe could get airborne. They ambushed German formations as they tried to assemble for attacks. And when German pilots tried to disengage and escape, the Mustangs followed. A German ace in a post-war interview recalled, "The Mustang pilots were very aggressive. They did not wait for us to come to them. They came looking for us. And once they found us, it was very hard to get away." For German pilots, the Mustang's presence over Germany was more than a tactical challenge. It was a psychological weight. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies over Europe, was now fighting defensively, over its own homeland, against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger every month. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe faced a crisis not of production, but of people. The factories still produced aircraft, but there were not enough trained pilots to fly them. The veterans who had survived the battles of 1943 and early 1944 were exhausted. Many had flown hundreds of missions. Younger pilots, pushed through shortened training programs, reached frontline units with only 50 hours of total flying time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone to fight experienced American pilots in combat. A young German pilot, perhaps 20 years old, might have arrived at his first unit in the spring of 1944 with fewer than 100 hours in the cockpit. He might have been given a Bf-109, shown the basics, and then sent into battle. His first mission might also be his last. Mustang pilots, many of whom had flown dozens of missions and had learned how to fight and survive, could recognize an inexperienced opponent in seconds, and they did not hesitate. By the summer of 1944, the Mustang was no longer just a fighter aircraft. It was the visible symbol of American industrial and military power over the European battlefield. It represented the ability to strike anywhere, at any time, and to do so without serious punishment. The Luftwaffe had not been completely destroyed, but it had been pushed to the margins. And when the Allies launched the invasion of France on the 6th of June 1944, the near absence of German air power over the beaches was no accident. It was the result of months of continuous air battles in which the P-51 Mustang had played a central role. Before dawn on the 6th of June 1944, as thousands of Allied soldiers prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy, the largest air armada in history gathered over the English Channel. 12,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance planes, filled the sky. Their mission was to make sure that the vulnerable invasion force, crossing the water and landing on the beaches, would not be attacked from above. At the heart of that protective shield were the P-51 Mustangs of the 8th and 9th Air Forces. The Mustangs flew continuous patrols over the invasion fleet and the landing zones. They circled high above, watching for German bombers or fighters trying to break through. They escorted transport aircraft carrying paratroopers, and they attacked German airfields and radar stations behind the coast, preventing the Luftwaffe from organizing any kind of coordinated response. The Luftwaffe's reaction to the invasion was weak and scattered. In those crucial first hours of the landings, German aircraft flew only a handful of sorties over the beaches. Some were intercepted and shot down before they reached the shoreline. Others turned back when they encountered overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters. By midday, the sky over Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. The reasons for the Luftwaffe's weakness were no mystery. Months of attrition had drained its ranks. Airfields in France had been bombed again and again. Experienced pilots had been killed or sent back to defend Germany itself, and the young pilots who remained, many with less than 100 hours of flying time, were no match for veteran American and British pilots flying Mustangs, Spitfires, and Thunderbolts. One infantryman who landed on Omaha Beach later recalled, "We looked up and saw our planes everywhere. There wasn't a single German plane in sight. For the first time, I believed we could really win this war." D-Day was a ground invasion, but it succeeded partly because of what had already been won in the air during the previous months. The P-51 Mustang, flying cover over the beaches, was the physical expression of air supremacy. The Allies did not just land in France, they landed with complete control of the sky. By the autumn of 1944, the air war over Germany had entered its final and most brutal phase. The Luftwaffe, although still able to mount fierce resistance on some occasions, was only a shadow of what it had once been. Its losses in pilots and aircraft had become unsustainable. American fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, now roamed at will over German airspace, hunting targets on the ground as well as in the air. Mustangs swept German airfields, destroying aircraft before they could take off. They attacked trains, bridges, and convoys, cutting supply lines. They hit synthetic oil plants, the lifeblood of the German war machine. And they hunted the Luftwaffe's last hope, the Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262, powered by 2 turbojet engines, was faster than any Allied fighter in level flight. In theory, it represented a technological leap that might have challenged Allied air supremacy. In practice, it arrived too late, and in numbers too small. More importantly, the Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when its speed advantage disappeared. Mustang pilots learned to patrol near Me-262 bases and wait. When the jets slowed to land, the Mustangs struck. It was not a fair fight, but it was effective. Even Germany's most successful pilots could not change the outcome. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history with 352 confirmed victories, spent the final months of the war flying defensive missions over Germany. In a post-war interview, he stated simply, "When the Mustangs appeared in large numbers, we lost our freedom in the air. We could still fight, but we could no longer control where or when the battles took place." In March 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force reached a new breaking point. That month alone, German units wrote off more than half of their single-engine fighters, 56.4% of the aircraft available on March 1st, and lost nearly 22% of their fighter pilots. It was not just machines that disappeared from the roster, but also many of the formation leaders, tacticians, and teachers the Luftwaffe could not easily replace. Every loss punched a hole in the thin line of experience holding the defense of the Reich together. For American bomber crews, the Mustang's presence changed the odds. Where a bomber crew had once faced perhaps a 1 in 5 chance of surviving a full tour of 25 missions, by the end of 1944 the survival rate had improved dramatically. Bombers still faced flak and the occasional Luftwaffe attack, but they no longer flew alone into the heart of Germany. A bomber crewman, in a letter home late in 1944, might have written, "The sky is different now. We still see flak, and sometimes we see German fighters, but our Mustangs are always there. We don't feel alone anymore." By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, The P-51 Mustang had destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the European theater, more than any other Allied fighter. It had escorted bombers to every major target in Germany. It had flown missions lasting up to 8 hours. And it had done something no other fighter of the early war years could do. It had gone all the way to the targets with the American bombers and brought them home again. After the war, Allied interrogators asked captured German officers which weapon had hurt them the most. They did not name the atomic bomb, which had been used only against Japan. They did not name the Soviet T-34 tank, which had smashed German armor on the Eastern Front. They did not name the Allied bomber fleets, which had leveled German cities. Instead, many of them named the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang represented more than a single fighter aircraft. It embodied a particular way of making war, not based only on individual heroism or isolated technological brilliance, but on systems, logistics, and industrial capacity. The Mustang's long range existed because of American oil production. Its drop tanks were built in factories running 24 hours a day. Its Packard-built Merlin engines came off assembly lines that produced thousands of units. Its radios, guns, and instruments were the products of a vast industrial network spread across the United States. Germany had built its air force around the idea of elite fighter pilots, aces, individual warriors who could change the course of a battle through skill and bravery. That philosophy worked in the early years of the war, when German pilots were the most experienced and best trained in the world. But it could not scale. When those pilots were killed, they could not be replaced quickly enough. And when the enemy arrived not only with skilled pilots, but also with superior numbers, superior logistics, and superior range, the German system collapsed. The United States, by contrast, built a system that could replace losses, could train new pilots continuously, and could deliver fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to bases across Britain and later across Europe. The Mustang was the sharp edge of that system, a fighter that could turn American strengths into pressure on the enemy. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been built. They served not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and China. They flew escort missions, ground attack sorties, and reconnaissance flights. And they saved tens of thousands of American airmen's lives by making sure the bombers could reach their targets and return. The P-51 Mustang began as a disappointment, a prototype with a promising design but a deadly weakness. It ended as the fighter that won the air war over Europe. Its transformation was not an accident. It was the result of engineering insight, industrial capacity, and strategic vision. And when German officers said after the war that the Mustang had hurt them most, they were recognizing not only the quality of one aircraft, but the power of the system that designed it, built it, and used it to take control of the sky. And it all began with one man, Ronald W. Harker, who saw potential where others saw only a problem. A test pilot who flew an aircraft one April afternoon and had an idea. A simple idea. What would happen if you changed the engine? Sometimes that is all it takes. One person, one idea, and the willingness to believe that something better is possible. The Luftwaffe never recovered. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies, and at the center of that victory was a fighter aircraft that no one, back in 1942, believed would ever matter. But because one man saw what it could become, the P-51 Mustang became the aircraft that changed the sky. And sometimes that is all history needs. If you're interested in more historical stories, please follow Beyond History, a place where we tell historical stories from a slower, deeper angle, to find out what truly happened next. Your support is the biggest motivation that helps us bring more meaningful and engaging stories to you. Please, so you don't miss the stories that changed the fate of the world.